Hello, everyone. Welcome to the state of Kentucky. I'm Bruce Maples, publisher of Forward Kentucky, and we're glad you're with us today. We have an interesting show in front of us. We've got Shannon Fabert, and I'm going to make sure I'm pronouncing that right in just a minute, who is a candidate for Congress, and she's going to be joining us in just a minute. And we had scheduled Senator Morgan McGarvey. We're waiting to see if he can get logged in. So we're going to welcome Miss Shannon first. I need to remind you a couple of things. First of all, if you comment on Facebook or YouTube, if you're watching us live, we can show those on the screen, and if they've got questions for whoever's speaking, we might share them and get some answers for them. And we are glad to have you here today. So let's welcome in Shannon Fabert, and I want to be sure I'm saying that right. Am I pronouncing that last name correctly?
It's actually Fabert. Long name.
Okay, got it. Fabert. Really glad to have you with us today. You're running for the opportunity to take on Mr. Massie. First question, important question. How are you and your family doing?
We are well, actually. My husband is considered essential, but his work has taken extra precautions to make sure that everybody is safe, that they're coming into the building without temperatures. You know, they're checking everybody. They have an enormous amount of supplies to make sure that everything stays clean. So we're doing pretty well. And I already worked from home, so I haven't gone out that much.
Yeah, good. I'm glad that wherever he works, they're taking good care of him as well. You have, I think, an interesting background in your family. You mentioned on your website about activism. Can you tell us about that?
Absolutely. So my father is a Black man who was raised mostly in Florida. And actually, when they moved, my grandfather was in the Army, and he was in one of the first integrated units actually in the Army. And then they were in Maryland. They moved from Maryland back home to Florida. And at the time, the schools were actually not were not integrated. And this was in 64, I believe. And he and his older sister actually integrated their school, their junior high school and high school.
Wow.
And it's just, my family has always just been, we're a little loud. So. And my grandfather was very clear that if the military can have, you know, integrated units, then public schools are going to be integrated as well.
Sure. So you met your husband at UPS, and I moved to Northern Kentucky in 2009. I wouldn't normally bring this up because people's candidates are themselves, and their family is not the point. But I remember reading that I think the two of you did a sports show. Is that correct?
Yeah, actually, we decided that we were going to start a sportscast called Favorite for the Win, and we started during football season, and we had a couple of episodes out there. So it's something for us to do together. We really enjoy, he and I enjoy, golfing and cooking and all of those things together. And he really is my best friend, not just my husband. And so we just thought it'd be a fun way for us to, get on and talk about sports, because all of our friends and family have always said, you guys need a sports show. And I was like, I don't know if that's a good idea or not. So we went for it.
Well, Favorite for the Win is not a bad campaign slogan either.
I might have used it a couple of times.
Yeah. So let's talk about that. So what do you bring to the table as a candidate? You've got a contested primary. We can talk about that in a minute. So what attributes or what skills or what talents or whatever do you bring to the table as a candidate?
So my background at FedEx, actually, not UPS. I started out in operations management and moved from operations management into business consulting. And in that business consulting, business process consulting and continuous improvement, I worked with, large companies, small companies, really sat down, with CEOs, frontline workers to really make things work for them. And it was largely about communication. We were, 80% of the way there. Let's sit down and figure out how we make this really work and how we, continue in progress to make the company great. I firmly believe those skills, sitting in those boardrooms, is a skill that I believe we need in Congress as well. We look at ideologues and we say, they're all or nothing, and I don't think that's the way. I don't think that's the way people think. I don't think that's the way we make progress, and I don't think that the people of Kentucky want that. And so I offer that as, like I said, as a continuous improvement consultant in a variety of fields, sectors. I've been there, and I sat there as the youngest person in the room many a time. Where people sit there and said, "Well, can't you do this?" And being able to sit there in the room, in a room full of men, and make it work, I feel as though that's something that is valuable and is needed right now.
When I was working in the corporate world, I also did some process consulting, and I actually taught process consulting and process design. And one of the things that struck me was that some people seemed to get it and some people just didn't and didn't understand it. And they would operate off of, like you said, I mean, we have ideologues in the corporate world as well. And they would operate off of, okay, this is what I want, rather than this is what's going to work. So Would you say that then that you would be better able to work across the aisle because what you're focused on is the idea and not the ideologue part?
100%. Actually, and to your point, everybody has a different range in accepting change. And so it really is a matter of, we have, if you've ever, you've seen the change curve or how people, accept change. You have your early adopters, and then you have, the mainstream is going to take a little longer than those early adopters. And then you're always going to have those people by default are going to try everything they possibly can to not make it happen. Sometimes you got to kill them with kindness.
Yeah. So how is your campaign going?
It's actually going really well. So the shift, it's unfortunate that we all had to shift into this quarantine mode, but my team has been really agile and accepting, okay, so what can we do now? And, the things that we're missing from a face-to-face contact, in-person contact, we've made up for in other ways. My team, I feel, was uniquely ready to make that change because right now I'm in IT consulting. So some of the newfangled things that are happening, such as using Zoom and how to, create town halls and such, were things that were kind of up my alley as was.
That's cool. So Northern Kentucky is an interesting space. On the one hand, it's traditionally been fairly Republican. On the other hand, there was some flip in the Beshear election, at least. What sort of sense do you have of how much chance you or Dr. Owensby have at unseating Thomas Massie?
I really believe, and part of the reason why I jumped in this race, I think people are ready for something that is not so rigid. And not just the Democrats, but I think the Republicans are ready for somebody who is going to work with them and not just, put profit over the people. And so, I hear, as I've worked with people on this campaign, Democrats and Republicans alike, the one thing that when we sit down and we talk, I believe that we're 80% of the way there. I think ideally speaking, people, I don't think anybody raises their hand and said, I want crappy schools, right?
Yeah.
So, the concept of taking money out of school teachers' hands, I think is a terrible idea. Out of schools' hands is a terrible idea. And I think people are just ready for something new.
Do you think that it's about a different political philosophy, or is it specific to Thomas Massie?
So I would say I think it's about a different political philosophy. It just so happens that Thomas Massie is that person over there. Okay. We are not running a campaign that says, I'm just not him, as some other people are.
So you don't really care whether he wins his primary or his opponent wins?
Not in particular, because I believe in the merits of the campaign and the merits of, when you look at my policies that are on the issues, I stand by those regardless of who's running on the other side.
We had Dr. Owensby on last week, and that was a very interesting interview to interview a candidate who's in a mask and gown. Have you spoken to her, and are y'all planning any debates or forums?
So she and I are friends. In this process early on, we actually have gotten to know each other pretty well, and I think she's a wonderful person. And what she's doing right now, is just amazingly brave. Her and every other nurse and healthcare worker out there. I'm praying for them every night. And from a debate perspective, we have reached out to the campaign, to their campaign, and asked whether or not they would consider doing forums and debates. And right now, it's been a no.
Okay. Maybe Forward Kentucky should sponsor a debate or a forum. That might be an interesting idea.
That would be fantastic.
So anytime I interview a candidate, I always end with the same question. You're standing on my front porch, except now, of course, you're standing on my virtual front porch. Why should I vote for you?
It's time for Kentucky to have somebody in its corner who is going to fight every single day. And that is one thing that I've been known for across the aisle in the corporate world, as we said, from a corporate perspective. And I can do it now. I've proven that. I'm not a person who is above listening to other people's ideas and working with them. And now is the time for us to make progress. And we cannot let perfect get in the way of progress. And we have to move forward. And we have to get these things for Kentucky right now. That includes an infrastructure plan that puts us back to work and gives us broadband as a utility. And we need somebody who's fighting for those things on a daily basis. And I'm that person.
Excellent. Shannon Fabert, not Fabert, but Fabert, candidate for Congress in Kentucky's 4th District. Thank you for coming on the State of Kentucky, and good luck with your campaign.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me. We'll talk soon.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye.
That was Shannon Fabert, who's running first against Dr. Alexandra Owensby for the Democratic nomination, and then we'll get to face whoever wins the Republican nomination in that district. We appreciate her coming on today. It's interesting. We just finished one of the more, I have to say, unique General Assembly sessions that we've had since I've been paying attention to politics. There are a lot of different people who serve in the General Assembly. Some of them, as Ms. Fabert was saying, are definitely ideologues. Some of them, on the other hand, are principled but able to work across the aisle and try and get some things done. And some of them are real leaders. And we're fortunate to have one of those join us now. Senator Morgan McGarvey, thank you for coming on the State of Kentucky.
Thanks, Bruce. Appreciate being here. And thanks for doing this, especially during this time.
Yeah, I had been thinking about doing some sort of video thing anyway, and the coronavirus sort of forced the issue out there. First question, more than anything else, how are you and your family doing?
Thanks for asking. I think, like for so many people, it is a real adjustment for us. I'm actually upstairs in the kids' playroom sort of area right now because they're all downstairs. We've got 3, 8, and younger here. The youngest being 20 months old. So it's been an adjustment as my wife and I both try to keep our jobs also. And but it's as the governor says, we are all in this together, and we're going to get through this together. And I do believe that. So that's what we're doing.
Well, thank you for taking time to be on the show, and thank your wife for taking care of 3 kids at the same time. Let's begin with just overall impression of the session.
Well, and
go ahead.
Overall impression. Sorry, you broke up there. Overall impression of the.
What was your overall impression of the session?
Got it. Yeah, it's like you said in the intro. It's one of the more bizarre sessions I think the General Assembly has ever had. It's most certainly the most bizarre session with which I've been experienced. Because I think also when you look at it, I think legislative leadership in the majority really felt even going into the middle of March that things weren't going to be all that different. And all of a sudden, long about March 12th, that's when we said, you know what, this is not going to be business as usual. We didn't come in March 13th, came in then the 17th, 18th, and 19th, but not again until March 26th, and then not again until April 1st. Some people questioned, me included, whether we should even be there at that time. And so it was a strange session. I think a lot of things were left on the cutting room floor, so to speak, because the end of the session is when a lot of the actual laws get passed. We did some good things. We needed to go back in and address some of the problems that we're all dealing with now in light of COVID-19. So I was proud of some of the work of the General Assembly, and that we expanded unemployment benefits, for part-time workers, for people who have lost their jobs but are an independent contractor or work for themselves, self-employed. We expanded unemployment insurance. We expanded the ability to apply for it. We expanded access to health care with the telehealth bill. We've extended statutes of limitations on which to file actions while the courts are closed right now. We codified a bunch of the governor's executive orders. Although this is a technical point, I think it's an important point. On the governor's orders that we didn't codify, we specified in statute that those orders can still stand, that the legislature, by codifying some of the existing orders and not others, were not stating a preference as to which orders could stand. So I think the legislature, even though of a different party, was supportive of the governor in that way, which is a good thing. So I think we did some good work on that. The budget, we did pass a budget. The Senate, when it introduced its budget, I thought it was draconian in nature in many respects, and it mishandled the moment of COVID-19. When the governor and the House did their budgets, COVID-19 wasn't on the radar.
Right.
Governor Beshear gave his address back in January and was talking about some of his campaign promises and some of the revenue raising things he wanted to do. Nobody figured that this is what Kentucky was going to look like. So the budget we passed is not punitive in nature. It does make some cuts, and that it doesn't expand things going in, but we're going to have some revenue cuts in Kentucky. We're not going to get as much money into the state budget as we had initially predicted. And so what we did is we passed a 1-year budget instead of a 2-year budget, because we know we'll be back in a special session, or at the very latest, January 5th of next year. And that way we'll know what our revenues look like. We'll also know what federal stimulus money we're going to get in. And so we can do a better job of crafting a budget that I think helps people.
So my next question was to ask you about any good bills and bad bills. It seems to me like you laid out a series of bills that you felt were good. What bad bills did you see come through? Which ones would you call out as being bad bills?
Yeah, we have a lot of hits this year, more than our hits. Just look at 2 bills that actually passed the House but died in the Senate, unfortunately. You had medical marijuana and sports gaming. Medical marijuana would be providing people a lot of relief right now and start a new industry in Kentucky. Sports gaming, although it's not a lot of money, it is a huge time when we need it. So I think those are 2 huge misses that we had. We still should have done criminal justice reform. We should have passed an automatic restoration of voting rights, particularly at a time when it's already more difficult for people to vote. The only thing the legislature did this year was make it even harder with the passage of Senate Bill 2, requiring a government-issued ID, and then the override of the governor's veto. I mean, we should have been looking at ways, especially right now, to make voting easier, whether it's mail-in ballots, automatic restoration of rights, that sort of thing, and we just made it harder. I think that was a mistake, particularly in a really important election year, regardless of which side of the aisle you're on. 2020 is a presidential election year. That's a very important year that only comes around every 4 years. So I think those are some big misses we had in the legislature that really there's bipartisan agreement on. Now, I'm not going to say that some of the Democratic priorities were misses. Of course, I think that, right? That's why we're out there fighting for those ideas and championing those causes.
Right.
But let's talk about the reality that the legislature is a supermajority Republican legislature in both houses. And when you see bills like that Democrats have been working on and, really pushing for a long time. I mean, the restoration of voting rights has been around every year since I've been in the General Assembly. There's finally bipartisan agreement on it. You see the passage through one chamber. To not get it through the Senate, I thought was a big disappointment.
You said the leadership was slow to acknowledge that the coronavirus was actually something to take seriously. What caused that to change?
I think I think it actually is sports. I think when we are in Kentucky, when March Madness was canceled, people said, "Wait a second, this thing's serious." So if you look back at that timeline, the NBA suspended its season on March 11th. March Madness was canceled on March 12th, and then every school in Kentucky shut down for 3 weeks on March 13th. I think that's when legislative leadership kind of said, "Okay, we've got a problem. We didn't come back that 13th or the following Monday, the 16th. Came in for 3 days, and I thought those 3 days were questionable unless we were considering budget or COVID-related bills, which
Right.
we did some of that. And then even to come in these last 2 days, yes, I know there's legislative business to be done, and I don't think the legislature should have adjourned what we call sine die. That's a big fancy word for adjourn without the ability to come back. I think we should have kept our days open in case there was a crisis the legislature could address. But I think we should have been more laser focused on state revenues, really helping the people and businesses that need them right now. Our small businesses are struggling. We know there's a lot of Kentuckians who are having trouble right now, whether it's going to work, keeping their job, applying for unemployment. There are things the legislature could do to help. And I think we just should have particularly focused on those things.
Of course, Governor Beshear has been getting a lot of praise, a lot of love across the country, even for his leadership during this time. And yet there were some bills that were passed that seemed to try to take some power away from the governor. Do you think that the coronavirus epidemic or pandemic caused there to be less of those? Or do you think that the GOP was like, well, we got to do something about this before the session ended?
Well, since you sort of asked two different questions, I will say yes and no. There were a lot of bills out there to limit the governor's power. That's part of the national Republican playbook. We've seen it in North Carolina. We've seen it in Wisconsin. We've seen it in other states where you've got a Republican legislature that then unexpectedly a Democratic governor comes in. I think that's unfortunate because we need to look at this as the office of the governor, not a Democrat or a Republican. Despite what I consider to be many abuses of power by the Bevin administration, you didn't see for the Democrats calling to reduce the power of the governor's office because we're a full-time legislature. The governor needs to have some flexibility in how to run the state when we're not and can't be in session. So I think it was particularly egregious this year. Some of those bills went away after COVID-19. So we didn't see some of those bills come up. The transportation bill that would have stripped the governor of the ability to control the road fund and build infrastructure, put the Secretary of Transportation basically under the control of the legislature. That bill didn't happen. The bill limiting the governor's power on appointments to boards and commissions didn't happen. So some of those bills went away. But still in the budget bill, we did limit some of the governor's power in ways that we haven't seen before. And they're ways that seem small. And for people who don't pay that much attention to the process, or even for people who do pay attention to the process, right? These are seemingly small changes. I'll give you an example of one of them. In the revenue bill, we passed a provision that said no longer does the budget director for the governor's office resolve budget disputes. It's the attorney general. That has never happened. That law has been on the books for 38 years. There's never been a problem with it through Democrat or Republican governors, but we've always had a Democratic attorney general. Now that we have the first Republican attorney general and a Democratic governor, you see the legislature putting that power in the hands of a person who, quite frankly, isn't and shouldn't be a budget expert.
Right.
We expect the attorney general to be the top law enforcement official and the state's attorney, not the state's budget director. So I think to take that expertise away is something that is purely political in nature and will tie the governor's hands, especially as we're getting in federal stimulus money, as we are dealing with plummeting revenues. Resolving those budget disputes is going to be a big deal in the coming year. And I was really sorry to see us do what I think are almost petty little things like that.
Well, the other one that I think is really critical is the change in the language around changing the manner of elections.
Yes.
I was glad to see that added. I mean, I wrote an article about the fact that one word changed the ability to change the way we do elections in the state. But then the legislature overrode the veto and said that the Secretary of State and the governor were co-equal in deciding that. And I just thought that was a really unfortunate change.
Yes. Again, another great example, Bruce. And since you gave that example, I'll also add on to it. One of the problems I had was particularly with the vetoes. Again, it seems like a small thing, but the governor used line item vetoes. And he left alone really all of the legislative appropriations in
Right.
doing this. He just went through and removed the language, a lot of the language that would have tied his hands, like you're talking about. But rather than take up each of his line item vetoes individually, as the legislature has traditionally done, we made it an all or nothing package. So Governor Bevin, he vetoed the entire budget one year. We had no choice. It was to override the whole thing or not.
Right.
On a line item, the governor went through and carefully gave each provision in the budget weight and whether or not to veto it. Every provision in the revenue bill, weight and whether or not to veto it. He deserved the same consideration from the legislature. If he's going to take the time to be thoughtful and use a scalpel, we should have done the same thing.
Right.
And consider each one of those vetoes. Look, there's some things the governor vetoed that I might have voted to override. There's things obviously I would have voted to sustain his veto on, but we should have had that opportunity. And I really object to the process that was used. Of course, one of the things that really bothered me about it is they said we didn't have time to consider the entire package. Again, the most important thing we're doing is COVID-19 relief and the budget and the revenue of the state. That's what we had time to do. We shouldn't have used some of the other opportunities that we were passing, some of the political bills and the gamesmanship of the last 2 days. That was the waste of time. This was an important use of the time for both the legislature and our independents and the people of Kentucky.
I find it interesting that they talked about not having enough time, and yet they had enough time to pass a bill related to served meat.
Right, that's exactly right. And we saw politics at play too. The Senate passed 2 abortion bills after 9 o'clock at night on the last day of the legislative session. Now, one of those bills passed the Senate in January before being passed by the House on the last day. The other one of those bills was introduced in the House in middle February and was received by the Senate far in advance of the COVID crisis. So, that's an example again of they're giving the governor bills that they want to see whether he'll veto or not. It wasn't to maintain the legislative veto. It was to kind of, make a political serve there looking towards November. But you know what? I am not a Pollyanna. Oftentimes politics can be a contact sport, and both sides engage in political activity when we're in the legislature. But that wasn't this moment. When you're coming back in on April 14th and 15th of 2020 in the middle of this pandemic, when we're quite frankly putting members and their families and staff and employees and their families at risk, we should have been considering things that were relevant to this crisis in the state's revenues.
Right. So let's switch to one other topic, the protesters. We had a collection of people who wound up gathering not socially distanced outside the governor's briefing room and making their voices heard and their shofar and so on and so forth. Do you have any thoughts about that whole episode? And let me add to that. Do you think that any of the GOP leadership was involved?
Well, okay, a lot of questions there. I'll start off with your last first and just say I don't know if any of the GOP leadership was involved. The part of me that remains an optimist wants to think they were not. And many of the people in Republican leadership, I disagree with them on political issues, but I have respect for them.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think they would have organized that. At least I'd like to think that. So I'll start there. I do know that there were individual members who were involved in that, but I have no reason to believe leadership was. If I'm proven wrong on that, I'll be the first one to stand up and condemn them for organizing such an action. I'll also tell you, I think it was interesting about the protesters. I'm a big believer in the First Amendment. And so I think people have First Amendment rights. They have rights of speech. And I don't think we should be kicking people off the Capitol grounds, voicing their opinion, whether it's teachers coming to protest their benefits being taken away or people coming to protest what the governor is doing in the middle of the COVID-19 shutdown. They have that right. I do want people to know how orchestrated it was, though. And I think one of the things I've seen online right now is, we didn't know the governor was going to be talking about new cases, and we didn't know the governor was going to be talking about how many people had died. I don't find that to be disingenuous. I took a picture and went back on my phone. Our office in the Capitol, our Capitol office is right outside the Senate, which is on the opposite side of the Capitol building as the governor's office and where he does those press briefings. He does his press briefings in room 110. It's truly the complete opposite side of the building. Well, at 5:04 p.m., all of those protesters were gathered outside the legislative chamber. I have a picture of them socially distanced on the lawn at 5 o'clock in the afternoon. It was when the governor started speaking in those impactful moments that they all rushed towards the governor's window and then began disturbing the broadcast. That was an intentional effort. They knew what they were doing. I don't know if they got the response they wanted, but it was intentional. I also think it's important to know that while we have First Amendment rights, the governor doesn't have a television studio. You know, if you went and stood outside Wave 3 or WLKY, WHS, pick your station, right? You couldn't hear protesters outside that building.
Right.
The governor is doing this in what is traditionally even just a press briefing room that has windows and isn't made to drown out outside noise. I do think it's important for people to get their voices heard. They could have done that through the protest. I think speaking over the governor directly outside of his window was disrespectful.
I thought it was intriguing. One person has sent me a message noting that all of the protests in these various states, and of course Michigan's was much bigger, were all on the same day. So I think that's interesting. Let's wrap up by talking about the plan about reopening. Do you have any thoughts on that? The protesters seem to want us to reopen immediately, and yet the governor announced that we are now part of a Midwest consortium on reopening. One of the reporters covering Frankfurt said, I'm really glad to see that we're now a Midwestern state and not a Southern state. And he said, when's our invitation to the Big Ten? So what do you think about the reopening process, and what do you think should be done?
Yeah, so it's funny you say that. I'll start with the geography first. I've noticed, I'm from Kentucky, born and raised here. Everybody south of us thinks we're a Midwest state. Everybody north of us thinks we're a Southern state. So yeah, maybe this will be a debate once and for all. I am talking with the governor's office. To go daily is probably an understatement. It's many times a day. They are working on this effort 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Their top staff are really devoted to. They are trying to keep the people of Kentucky safe. They're trying to look out for the businesses of Kentucky, and they do want things to get back open as soon as it is safe and responsible to do so. They are being guided by data and evidence. They are listening to health experts. But, I've seen some almost talking points out there that he's not considering reopening or he's not talking to businesses. The governor is talking and listening to everyone, the hospitals, the businesses, the restaurants, people, the schools, right? He is trying to make the best decisions possible. And I think it's good that he has now expanded that to the Midwestern states, especially Indiana. As you know, Bruce, living in Louisville, as we do, how many people come in from Indiana into Kentucky, and how many people from Kentucky go to Indiana on a daily basis? The same is true in Northern Kentucky, certainly with Ohio. And so I think it's really good that we're having that conversation, because there isn't that, firm border between the states. So we go across daily. So I think they are looking at it, but they are being guided by the data. We don't want to flood our hospitals. We know our hospitals don't have enough PPE as it stands today. They do have beds available, but as soon as those hospitals potentially become an overflow unit for nursing homes, whatever, we don't know what that looks like. It's good right now to continue to flatten the curve, to stop the spread of this virus. So, and that's the goal, right? We talk about flattening the curve. We talk about stopping the spread. And what the governor sometimes doesn't do is finish the sentence, so that we can reopen and get back to, it'll be a new normal, but so that we can get back to some form of normal. And I think whether you're a Democrat, a Republican, an independent, or somewhere in between, we want people to be safe. We want businesses to resume. We want kids to be able to go to school and learn. We all want those same things. We just have to make sure that we are doing it truly guided by data and evidence, not guided by gut feel and just personal desire, right? That we're doing what is best for the most number of people.
Right. Senator Morgan McGarvey, thank you for being with us today. Is there anything that I didn't ask you that you wish I had?
I can't think of it now, Bruce. One of the things I enjoy about you is you are always very thorough and you know what's going on. So I appreciate you providing this service for people watching.
Thank you very much. You can share with people that the session is recorded, and so it'll be up on Facebook and YouTube and our site later today. It's also available as a podcast. I would encourage anybody watching or who watches later, if you are not signed up for Senator McGarvey's newsletter, you should do so. It is one of the more erudite and interesting newsletters that comes out of Frankfurt. I get pretty much all of them, but yours is the one that I always make a point to open because I know it's going to be interesting and have a different perspective.
Well, thank you. I'm actually going, as soon as we hang up, I'm wearing shorts right now, but I'm going downstairs and I'm going to finish the newsletter. So you will get it this afternoon, hopefully.
Sounds excellent. Senator Morgan McGarvey, thank you for being with us, and stay safe.
Thanks, Bruce. You do the same.
All right. That was Senator Morgan McGarvey, senator in the Kentucky Senate, one of the leaders of the Democrats in Frankfurt. We appreciate him being with us today. Earlier today, there was another protest in Frankfurt. I've been busy getting ready for this, and so I haven't checked to see how that went. I agree with everybody who has said that people have the right to have their opinions heard, no matter what their opinions are. But I hope that the governor pays attention to the data, the science, and uses caution as we plan to do the reopening. The worst thing we could do is do it too soon, because then we would see, instead of a Midwestern reopening, we'd see a Midwestern spike, and none of us want that. All of you that are watching and all of you that have watched later, please take care of yourselves. If you're not signed up for our newsletters, you can do that. Let me make sure that I put that up. You can also become a member of Forward Kentucky at this address. And finally, if you have anything you'd like to suggest, including guests for the show, you can send it to tips@forwardky.com. Again, thank you for joining us, and we'll see you next week.